Racist cop punches elderly black woman in the mall. But when her son arrived, their faces turned pale. Welcome to today's story. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next exciting stories. Let's dive in. The morning sunlight streamed through the curtains of Evelyn Mitchell's modest kitchen. It was one of those quiet mornings, the kind that had come to define her life in the small town of Brookside. Evelyn, now 72 years old, moved with the calm precision of someone who had lived a long, thoughtful life. The smell of fresh brewed coffee filled the air, and as she sipped from her cup, she glanced out the window at the garden she had cultivated over the years. Each plant, each flower, had a story, a moment in her life when she needed something to nurture. Her husband, George, had passed away 5 years ago, and though the pain of his loss still lingered, Evelyn had found solace in her routines. The small bungalow they had shared was now hers alone, but she often thought of George as she went about her day, tending to the life they had built together. A framed photograph of the two of them on their wedding day sat on the table beside her, the edges of the photo worn from years of being held and remembered. She smiled as she looked at it, though a touch of sadness always came with the memory. Evelyn had always been a morning person. Even in her later years, she rose with the sun, eager to begin her day. Today, like many other days, she had planned a trip to Brookside Mall for groceries. It wasn't a large mall, but it was the centerpiece of the town, a place where people gathered to do their shopping, catch up on local gossip, or simply pass the time. She reached for her cane, leaning on it slightly as she walked around the kitchen. Her body wasn't as agile as it once was. Age had slowed her down, but not her spirit. The rhythmic sound of her cane tapping against the floor had become a familiar soundtrack to her movements. Despite the limitations her age imposed, she prided herself on her independence. She still drove her own car, handled her errands, and lived in her own home, though her son David would have preferred she accept more help. David. Her heart swelled at the thought of him, a good son and a man who had dedicated his life to protecting others. He was a police captain in the city, and though his job kept him busy, he called her every day without fail. He worried about her, sometimes too much, she thought, but that was the nature of his profession. He had seen too much, perhaps, and it made him cautious. As she prepared to leave the house, Evelyn's thoughts drifted to the conversation she had with David the night before. He had been his usual self, reminding her to call if she needed anything. "Mom, you know you can call me if anything happens. I can be there in 15 minutes, David had said, his voice a mix of concern and warmth. "I know, David," Evelyn had replied, smiling at his protective tone. "But I'm not a child. I can still take care of myself." David chuckled at the other end of the line. "I know, Mom, but humor me, all right?" Evelyn had promised to call if she needed him, though she knew she likely wouldn't. She had always been self-sufficient, and while she appreciated David's concern, she didn't want to trouble him over something small. Today was just another ordinary day at the mall, she told herself. Nothing to worry about. The weather was perfect for a drive, bright clear skies and a gentle breeze that made the leaves on the trees dance as she passed them. Brookside was a picturesque town, with quiet streets lined with old oak trees and houses that had stood for generations. Evelyn had lived here most of her life, watching as the town grew and changed, though it still held on to its small-town charm. As she drove, she hummed softly to herself, enjoying the feel of the warm sun filtering through the car windows. The radio played quietly in the background, the familiar voice of a local DJ filling the car with music from years past. It was a small luxury, this time alone with her thoughts, and Evelyn cherished it. When she arrived at the mall, she parked in her usual spot, not too far from the entrance, but far enough to enjoy a short walk. The lot was busy for a weekday, but that didn't bother her. She liked the hustle and bustle of people going about their day, each with their own errands and tasks. It reminded her that life, in all its small ways, was moving forward. As she stepped out of the car, her cane in hand, she took a moment to steady herself. Her legs weren't as strong as they once were, but she had learned to pace herself. There was no rush. She glanced around the parking lot, noticing a few familiar faces from town. People she had known for years, but with whom she exchanged only passing pleasantries. Her favorite part of the mall was the grocery section. It was always well-stocked with fresh produce, and she took her time selecting the best vegetables, carefully examining each item before placing it in her cart. She smiled at the young cashier as she passed, exchanging a quick greeting. As she moved through the aisles, Evelyn felt a sense of peace. There was something comforting about the routine, choosing the same items she always bought, knowing exactly where to find everything: milk, bread, vegetables, and of course, her favorite tea. She liked to stock up on the things she enjoyed, especially since they were small luxuries in her otherwise simple life. The sound of her cane tapping against the tiled floor echoed softly as she made her way through the store. She moved slowly, careful not to rush herself. Her knees ached a little more than usual today, but she didn't mind. It was part of growing older, she told herself. She had lived a good life, and a little discomfort wasn't going to stop her from enjoying her days. She smiled at a young mother pushing a stroller past her, nodding politely as they exchanged glances. Evelyn had always loved children, though she had only one of her own. David had been her world since the day he was born, and though she had hoped for more children, life had other plans. Still, she was content. Her life had been full in other ways, and she had no regrets. As she approached the checkout line, Evelyn carefully placed her items on the conveyor belt, watching as the cashier scanned each one. She reached into her purse for her wallet, pulling out the exact amount she needed. Evelyn was always precise when it came to money. She had grown up at a time when every penny counted, and that habit had stayed with her. Once her groceries were bagged, Evelyn thanked the cashier and made her way toward the exit. Her body was tired, her legs aching a little more with each step, but she was content. She had everything she needed for the week, and soon she would be home, sipping her tea and enjoying the quiet of her garden. But just as she reached the mall's sliding doors, something unexpected happened. Two large men in dark uniforms stepped into her path, their expressions stern and unwelcoming. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat as she looked up at them, her grip tightening on her cane. "Ma'am," one of the men said, his voice low and serious, "we need to talk to you." Evelyn blinked, confused. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her voice calm but edged with worry. The taller of the two men crossed his arms, his gaze hard and unyielding. "We've received reports that you've been shoplifting," he said bluntly. Evelyn felt the words hit her like a physical blow. Shoplifting? The accusation was so absurd that for a moment she didn't know how to respond. She had never stolen anything in her life. She prided herself on her honesty, her integrity. The very thought of being accused of such a thing made her heart race. "No, sir," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I paid for all of my things." She reached into her bag, fumbling for the receipt. Her hands shook as she pulled it out and held it up for the men to see. But they didn't look at it. They didn't even glance at the small piece of paper in her hand. "We need you to come with us," the other man said, his voice cold and unfeeling. Evelyn's stomach twisted in knots. She looked around, hoping someone, anyone, would notice what was happening. But the other shoppers had stopped to watch, their eyes filled with curiosity and judgment. No one stepped forward to help. "I didn't steal anything," she tried to explain again, her voice barely above a whisper. Her fingers clutched the handle of her cane, her body tense with fear and confusion. The first officer, Sanders, stepped closer, his massive frame casting a shadow over her. Without warning, he reached out and grabbed her arm. The sudden, rough grip made Evelyn flinch, and she nearly dropped her cane. "Let go of me," she said, her voice shaking, but her words fell on deaf ears. The man tightened his grip and began to pull her toward the back of the store. Panic surged through Evelyn as she struggled to free herself. Her heart raced, her breathing quickened, and her mind spun with disbelief. How could this be happening? Why wouldn't they just check her receipt? Her purse, which had been hanging loosely from her arm, slipped in the struggle. Her phone tumbled out and hit the floor with a soft thud. The officers didn't notice, but Evelyn did. And in that moment, she remembered David's words, "Call me if anything happens." With shaking hands, Evelyn reached for her phone. Her fingers fumbled as she tried to unlock it, her mind racing as the officers continued to pull her away. She could barely concentrate, her body trembling with fear, but she managed to press the call button, dialing David's number. The phone rang once, twice, then his familiar voice came through the line. "Mom, everything okay?" Evelyn's voice trembled as she whispered into the phone. "David, please come. They're hurting me." I don't know what to do." Her voice was barely audible, but it was enough for David to understand. "I'm on my way," he said, his voice sharp with urgency. "Hold on, Mom, I'm coming." As the call ended, Evelyn's heart raced even faster. She clutched the phone tightly in her hand, praying that David would arrive in time to stop this nightmare from unfolding any further. David's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he sped through the quiet streets of Brookside, his mind racing just as fast as the car. He had spent his career dealing with emergencies, but this one hit him differently. This was his mother. The thought of anyone laying a hand on her filled him with a fury he could barely contain. As he drove, he replayed her words over and over in his head. "They're hurting me." Those 4 words had shaken him to his core. His mother, Evelyn Mitchell, the strongest woman he knew, was in distress, and he wasn't there. David pressed harder on the gas pedal, weaving through the light afternoon traffic as he made his way to the mall. Brookside Mall wasn't far from his mother's house, maybe 15 minutes under normal conditions, but today it felt like it was a world away. Every second that passed felt like an eternity, and with each heartbeat, his mind conjured images of his mother being treated like a criminal. David had seen his share of rough treatment in his years on the force, but the idea of his mother being at the receiving end of such treatment, it was unbearable. As he approached the mall, David's pulse quickened even more. He could see the parking lot filled with cars and the mall entrance bustling with people going about their day. But all David could focus on was finding his mother. He parked hastily, not caring if the car was properly aligned in the spot, and jumped out, his heart pounding in his chest. David had always been calm under pressure. It was one of the things that made him a great police officer. But today was different. This was personal. As David entered the mall, his eyes scanned the area, searching for any sign of his mother. His eyes landed on a small crowd gathered near the back of the store, their attention fixed on someone, being pulled toward a side door. His heart dropped into his stomach as he realized what he was seeing. There, between 2 large security officers, was his mother. Evelyn Mitchell, a woman who had always carried herself with dignity and grace, was being manhandled by 2 men who seemed completely indifferent to the fear and confusion on her face. Her cane dangled from her hand as one of the men gripped her arm tightly, pulling her along like she was a criminal. David's blood boiled, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had learned long ago that anger, unchecked, could lead to mistakes. He had to approach this situation with clarity, but the sight of his mother, looking so small and fragile between those men, nearly shattered his composure. "Mom!" David's voice cut through the air, loud enough to make the crowd turn. Evelyn, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear, looked up at the sound of her son's voice. "David," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the noise of the mall. Tears welled up in her eyes, and for the first time in her life, she felt truly helpless. The 2 security officers, Jim Sanders and Mike Bennett, their name tags glinting under the fluorescent lights, turned to face David. They didn't release their hold on Evelyn, though one of them, Sanders, raised an eyebrow as if assessing the situation. "This is none of your business, sir," Sanders said gruffly, his voice low and authoritative. He clearly didn't recognize who David was. "Step back." David's fists clenched at his sides, but he kept his voice steady. He couldn't lose control. Not here, not now. "That's my mother," he said, his voice cold, measured. "Let her go." Bennett, the second officer, scoffed, tightening his grip on Evelyn's arm. "She's suspected of theft," he said, his tone filled with arrogance. "We're taking her to the back for questioning. Now, unless you want to get involved in this mess, I suggest you leave." David's jaw tightened, his anger rising with every word they spoke. But he forced himself to stay calm. He had to handle this the right way for his mother's sake. He knew that if he reacted emotionally, things could escalate. And the last thing he wanted was for this situation to spiral out of control. "You need to let her go," David said, his voice firm but controlled. "She's done nothing wrong. Check her receipt." The officers exchanged a glance, but neither of them moved. It was clear they weren't going to back down. Sanders took a step toward David, his broad shoulders blocking David's view of his mother. "Step back, or we'll call the police," Sanders said, his voice dripping with authority. David almost laughed at the absurdity of it all. Call the police. If only they knew. "Go ahead," David replied, his voice calm, though inside he was boiling with anger. "Call the police." Bennett, clearly thinking David was bluffing, puffed out his chest and took a step forward. "You don't understand how serious this is. We have orders. If you interfere, you'll be arrested too." David reached into his jacket, pulling out his badge and holding it up for both officers to see. "I am Captain David Mitchell, 15th Precinct," he said, his voice deadly calm. "Now I suggest you let go of my mother before you find yourselves in a lot more trouble than you're already in." Both officers froze. Their eyes widened as they stared at the badge, realizing they had just threatened a police captain, a man who outranked every single officer they could call. The color drained from their faces, and Sanders quickly released Evelyn's arm, stepping back with his hands raised in a show of surrender. "Captain, we didn't know," Sanders stammered, his voice shaky. "We were just following protocol." David's eyes darkened as he stepped closer, towering over the two officers. His mother, her arm now free, stood shakily behind him, her eyes filled with tears. David wanted nothing more than to tear into these men for what they had done, but he kept his composure, knowing that he had to handle this the right way. "You didn't know," David repeated, his voice soft but filled with a cold fury. "You didn't think to check her receipt? You didn't think to listen to her or to show her a little respect?" Bennett opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The shame and fear on their faces were unmistakable. They had made a mistake, and now they were realizing just how big of a mistake it was. David's presence was commanding, and the two officers, who had moments ago been arrogant and unyielding, now stood with their heads bowed, eyes downcast, like children caught misbehaving. Sanders, who had seemed so confident in his authority just moments ago, stammered an apology, his words tumbling out awkwardly. "We didn't mean—" Sanders started, but David cut him off with a sharp look. "You didn't think," David said, his voice tight with anger. "What if this had been your mother? What if she were the one being dragged through this mall, humiliated in front of strangers, without a single person willing to help her?" Both officers remained silent, their eyes wide with shame. David's question hung in the air, the weight of his words pressing down on them. Evelyn, still trembling from the ordeal, felt a wave of relief wash over her. David was here. She was safe now. David took a deep breath, steadying himself. His mother's safety was his priority, and he couldn't afford to let his anger get the better of him. He turned to Evelyn, his face softening as he gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Mom, are you okay?" Evelyn nodded slowly, her voice shaky but steady. "I'm okay now, David," she whispered. The fear that had gripped her heart was beginning to fade, replaced by a deep sense of relief. Her son had come to her aid, just as he always had. David turned back to the officers, his expression hardening once more. "You'll be hearing from Internal Affairs," he said, his voice cold and measured. "What you did here today is unacceptable, and there will be consequences." The officers stood frozen, their faces pale. They had been wrong, and now they would pay the price. Without another word, David wrapped his arm around his mother's shoulders and led her out of the store. The crowd, which had been watching the entire encounter, remained silent. David could feel their eyes on him, but he didn't care. All that mattered was getting his mother out of there. As they walked toward the car, David could feel the tension in his body begin to ease. His mother was safe, and that was all that mattered. But the anger he had kept at bay was still simmering beneath the surface. He would make sure those officers paid for what they had done. He would make sure no one else had to go through what his mother had endured. The drive home was quiet. Evelyn sat in the passenger seat, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her mind still reeling from the events at the mall. David glanced at her from time to time, his heart aching at the sight of her so shaken. His mother, who had always been so strong, had been reduced to a state of vulnerability he had never seen before. As they pulled into the driveway, David turned off the engine and sat in silence for a moment. He wanted to say something, anything to make her feel better, but the words wouldn't come. He had spent his entire career dealing with situations like this, but when it came to his mother, the rules didn't apply. "Let me help you," David said softly, getting out of the car and walking around to open the door for his mother. Evelyn accepted his help without protest, her legs unsteady as she stood. Her grip on the cane was tight, her body still trembling slightly from the shock of what had happened. Together they made their way into the house. The familiar warmth of her home greeted them, but the comfort Evelyn usually felt here seemed distant now. She sank into her favorite chair by the window, her hands resting on her knees as she stared out at the garden she had tended for so many years. David knelt beside her, gently taking her hand in his. "Mom, I'm so sorry this happened," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I should have been there sooner." Evelyn shook her head, her eyes soft but weary. "No, David. Don't blame yourself. You came when I needed you, and that's what matters." David clenched his jaw, his gaze dropping to the floor. The anger he had held back was beginning to rise again, but he knew he couldn't let it take over. He had to be strong for his mother, just as she had always been strong for him. "I'm going to make sure they pay for this," David said quietly, his voice filled with determination. "What they did, it's not right." Evelyn smiled weakly, squeezing his hand. "You've always been my protector," she said softly. "But this isn't just about me. There are others. People who don't have someone like you to stand up for them." David looked up at her, his heart heavy with the truth of her words. She was right. This wasn't just about his mother. This was about the system that allowed people like her to be mistreated without consequence. "We'll make sure no one else has to go through this," David said firmly, his resolve hardening. That night, as Evelyn rested, David sat at the kitchen table, his mind racing with everything that had happened. He knew what had to be done. Tomorrow he will file a formal complaint with Internal Affairs. The officers who had mistreated his mother would be held accountable, and the mall's security practices would be brought under scrutiny. David was a man of action. He didn't believe in letting things slide, especially when it came to his family. He had seen too many people suffer because others refused to take a stand. But this time, things will be different. This time, he had the power to make things right. The following morning, the sun rose over Brookside, casting long, golden rays across Evelyn Mitchell's quiet neighborhood. But inside her house, a different atmosphere lingered. The weight of yesterday's events still hung in the air. Evelyn sat at the kitchen table, staring down at her cup of tea, though she hadn't taken a sip. Her hands were steady now, but her mind was still racing with the confusion, fear, and humiliation she had felt at the mall. Her son, David, had already left for work early that morning. He had kissed her on the cheek and promised that today, things would begin to change. He had spent the night making phone calls, documenting the events in full, and preparing to file formal complaints against the two security officers who had mishandled his mother. Evelyn knew David would do everything in his power to hold those men accountable. But even as she sat there, a deep sense of unease settled over her. She had lived her entire life quietly, never drawing attention to herself. The mall incident had not only shocked her, but rattled something inside her that she hadn't expected. She had always prided herself on being strong, on facing life's challenges with grace and dignity. But yesterday she had felt powerless, something she hadn't experienced since she was a young black woman, growing up in a segregated world. She hadn't shared that part of her life much with David. She hadn't wanted to burden him with the details of the struggles she had faced, discrimination, prejudice, in a world that constantly reminded her that she was somehow less than. But the events at the mall had dredged up old feelings, old wounds that had never quite healed. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Slowly she rose from her chair and made her way across the room, her cane tapping softly against the floor. When she opened the door, she found her neighbor, Mrs. Hilda Carter, standing on the porch with a basket of muffins in hand. "Good morning, Evelyn," Hilda said, offering a warm smile. "I heard about what happened at the mall yesterday, and I just wanted to come by and check on you. I brought some blueberry muffins. They're fresh from the oven." Evelyn managed a smile as she accepted the basket. "Thank you, Hilda. You're too kind." She stepped aside to let Hilda in, grateful for the company. Hilda, a woman in her 60s with a warm and gentle demeanor, had been Evelyn's neighbor for years. The two women often exchanged small pleasantries, but had never been particularly close. However, today, Hilda seemed genuinely concerned, and Evelyn appreciated the gesture. As they sat down at the kitchen table, Hilda poured herself a cup of tea and gestured toward the basket of muffins. "Go on, try one. They'll do you some good after what you've been through." Evelyn took a muffin but didn't eat it right away. Instead, she sighed and looked out the window, her thoughts drifting back to the mall. "It's strange," she said quietly. "I've lived in this town for so long, and I've never felt unwelcome. But yesterday, I've never felt so small." Hilda nodded, her expression sympathetic. "I can't imagine what you went through, Evelyn. But I know one thing. What happened wasn't right. No one should be treated like that, especially not someone as kind and gentle as you." Evelyn smiled faintly at the compliment, but remained quiet for a moment. "It's more than just that," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What happened? It reminded me of a time when I wasn't allowed to walk into certain stores, or when I had to sit in the back of the bus. I thought those days were behind me." Hilda reached across the table and gently placed her hand on top of Evelyn's. "I'm so sorry, Evelyn. You've been through so much in your life, and you deserve better." "We all do." Evelyn nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She had never expected to be dragged back into a place of fear and powerlessness at this stage of her life. But here she was, facing the same kind of injustice she had fought so hard to overcome decades ago. That evening, David returned home, exhausted from a long day at the precinct, but determined to follow through on his promise. The complaint had been filed, and an internal investigation into the security officer's conduct was already underway. But David wasn't satisfied. He knew that justice wasn't something that would happen overnight, and he feared that without sustained pressure, the incident might be swept under the rug. After dinner, he sat down across from his mother at the kitchen table. The house was quiet, save for the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. David looked at his mother, who was quietly sipping her tea, and his heart ached. He had seen her go through difficult times before, but this felt different. She looked smaller now, more fragile, and it broke him inside. "Mom," David began, his voice gentle, "I filed the complaint today. Internal Affairs is going to investigate what happened, and those officers will face consequences for what they did." Evelyn nodded but didn't say anything. She appreciated David's efforts, but something was weighing heavily on her heart. David hesitated, then asked, "Are you okay?" Evelyn sighed softly and placed her cup down on the table. She looked at her son, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. "David, I'm so proud of you for everything you've done. You've always been my protector, and I can't thank you enough for coming to my aid yesterday." David reached across the table and took her hand. "Mom, I'm always going to protect you. You don't have to thank me for that." Evelyn smiled faintly, but then her expression grew more serious. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened, and I realize that this isn't just about me. It's about all the people who have been mistreated, who haven't had someone like you to stand up for them." David nodded, sensing where this conversation was going. "You're right, Mom. There are so many people out there who go through this every day, and they don't have anyone to fight for them. That's why I filed the complaint, so we can make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Evelyn's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I just didn't think I'd have to be part of this fight again. I thought those days were behind me." David squeezed her hand gently. "I know, Mom, and it's not fair that you have to go through this again, but maybe your story can make a difference. Maybe what happened to you can help shine a light on the problem." Evelyn nodded, though the weight of that responsibility felt heavy on her shoulders. She had always lived quietly, never seeking attention or recognition. But now her story was out there, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to carry the burden of being a symbol for something so much larger than herself. The next day, Evelyn's phone began to ring. It was local reporters, eager to get her side of the story. News of the incident at Brookside Mall spread quickly, and people were demanding answers. The town had always prided itself on being a welcoming, inclusive place, and the idea that someone like Evelyn, someone who had been part of the community for decades, could be treated this way had shaken people to their core. At first, Evelyn didn't want to talk to the reporters. She wasn't interested in making a spectacle of what had happened to her, but David encouraged her to speak out. "Mom, you don't have to do this if you don't want to, but your story could help others. It could make people realize that things need to change." After much thought, Evelyn agreed to an interview with a local news station. She sat in her living room, her hands folded neatly in her lap as the camera crew set up. The reporter, a young woman named Rachel Thompson, asked her questions about the incident, and Evelyn answered them as honestly as she could. "I've lived in Brookside for most of my life," Evelyn began, her voice steady but quiet. I've always felt safe here, always felt like I was part of this community. But what happened to me at the mall, it made me feel like I didn't belong. It made me feel like I was a criminal, simply because of the way I look. Rachel nodded, her expression sympathetic. Do you feel like this is part of a larger problem? Do you think people in positions of authority, like the security officers, are more likely to mistreat people of color? Evelyn hesitated for a moment before answering. I don't want to speak for everyone, she said carefully, but I do think there's a pattern. I think people who look like me are often seen as suspicious, even when we've done nothing wrong. And that's not fair. It's not right. The interview aired later that evening, and the response from the community was overwhelming. People who had known Evelyn for years, people who had shopped at the same mall, walked the same streets, began to speak out. They flooded social media with messages of support, calling for the mall to take responsibility for what had happened and demanding changes to prevent future incidents. For the next few days, Evelyn tried to return to her normal routine. She still visited her garden in the mornings, sipping her tea as she watched the flowers bloom. But there was a tension in the air that hadn't been there before. She could feel the weight of the attention her story had garnered, and while she appreciated the support, she wasn't sure how to handle being in the spotlight. David continued to work behind the scenes, pushing for a full investigation into the security officer's conduct and advocating for changes to the mall's policies. He knew that getting justice for his mother wasn't going to be easy, but he was determined to see it through. One evening, as the sun set over Brookside, Evelyn and David sat together on the porch, watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink. The world was quiet, and for a moment, it felt like everything had returned to normal. Do you think things will really change? Evelyn asked softly, her gaze focused on the horizon. David leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. I think they can, Mom, but change doesn't happen overnight. It takes time, and it takes people like you who are willing to stand up and say, this isn't right. Evelyn sighed, her heart heavy with the knowledge that the fight for justice was far from over. I'm not sure I'm ready to be that person, David. I'm just an old woman who wants to live her life in peace. David smiled, reaching over to squeeze her hand. You're more than that, Mom. You're a fighter. You always have been. Evelyn didn't respond, but in her heart she knew he was right. She had fought for justice before, and she would do it again, even if it meant stepping out of the quiet life she had grown so accustomed to. Several days after the media attention had shone a spotlight on Evelyn's story, the atmosphere in Brookside began to shift. It wasn't just the local community that was taking notice. Regional news outlets had picked up the story, amplifying the message far beyond the town's borders. Evelyn Mitchell's name became synonymous with a broader discussion on racial profiling, elder mistreatment, and the misuse of authority in public spaces. David had stayed in close contact with the Internal Affairs Division, following the progress of the investigation into the mall security team. His phone buzzed constantly with updates, but none had given him a concrete sense of where things stood. Despite the formal complaint he'd filed and the public outcry, David knew the wheels of justice often turn slowly. One afternoon, as David returned from work, he found his mother sitting on the porch, her eyes distant as she stared into the garden. He approached quietly, pulling up a chair beside her. Any word? Evelyn asked softly, as if reading his mind. David shook his head, frustration flickering in his eyes. Not yet. They're conducting interviews with the officers, but it seems like they're dragging their feet. Evelyn sighed, her shoulders sagging slightly. I'm not sure what's taking so long. I showed them the receipt. It should be clear I didn't do anything wrong. David reached out, placing a reassuring hand on his mother's. It's more complicated than that, Mom. They have to investigate all the details, but trust me, this isn't going away. Not after the media coverage. Evelyn nodded, though she still felt an underlying sense of dread. She had never wanted to be at the center of such a large controversy. All she had wanted was to be treated fairly, with dignity and respect. But now her face had become part of a larger movement, a movement that was rapidly gaining momentum. In the days that followed, the citizens of Brookside rallied behind Evelyn. What had started as whispers of outrage within the community had grown into a full-fledged movement. A group of local activists organized a peaceful protest outside the mall, calling for justice not only for Evelyn, but for all who had experienced discrimination and mistreatment. On a warm Saturday afternoon, Evelyn and David arrived at the mall to find a crowd gathered near the entrance. People held signs that read, "Respect our elders," and "End racial profiling now." The protest was peaceful, but the passion was palpable. As soon as Evelyn stepped out of the car, the crowd noticed her presence. A cheer went up, and people began to chant her name. Evelyn felt a wave of emotion wash over her as she walked toward the group, her cane tapping softly against the pavement. She had never asked for this attention, but seeing so many people rallying in her defense filled her with a deep sense of gratitude and responsibility. David walked beside her, his presence both protective and proud. He had always admired his mother's quiet strength, but today he saw a different side of her. The community had embraced her as a symbol of resilience, and though she had never sought the spotlight, she had risen to the occasion. One of the protest organizers, a young woman named Sarah Collins, approached Evelyn with a microphone in hand. "Mrs. Mitchell, would you like to say a few words?" Evelyn hesitated for a moment. She wasn't used to public speaking, and the idea of addressing such a large group made her nervous. But then she looked at the faces around her, the people who had shown up to support her, who were demanding justice on her behalf, and she knew she had to say something. Taking the microphone, Evelyn cleared her throat and spoke in a steady, calm voice. "I want to thank all of you for being here today. I never thought something like this would happen to me, not in a place I've called home for so many years. But what happened at the mall is part of a much bigger problem. Too many people are judged based on the way they look, or their age, or the color of their skin. And that's not right. It's not the world I want to live in, and it's not the world I want my son or my grandchildren to live in." The crowd listened intently, the atmosphere heavy with emotion as Evelyn continued. "I didn't ask to be in the spotlight, and I didn't want to become a symbol for something like this. But now that I'm here, I feel it's my responsibility to speak out. Not just for me, but for everyone who's been mistreated, everyone who's been made to feel small. I'm standing here because of all of you, and I'm grateful for your support." The crowd erupted in applause, and as Evelyn handed the microphone back to Sarah, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She had spoken her truth, and in doing so, she had given voice to so many others who had remained silent for too long. While the protest continued outside, David's focus remained on the investigation. He knew that while public support was essential, true justice would come through the system. His contacts within the department kept him informed, but there had been no significant updates from the mall or the security company. Both entities were keen to keep the incident as quiet as possible, hoping the public outrage would fade with time. But David wouldn't let that happen. He knew how these things worked, how institutions tried to bury their mistakes under layers of bureaucracy and delay. He had seen it before, and he wasn't about to let his mother's case become another statistic in a long line of unaddressed injustices. One evening, as David sat at his desk going through case files, his phone rang. It was Lieutenant Angela Morris, the head of the Internal Affairs Division. David had worked with her in the past, and he knew she was someone who took her job seriously. "David," Angela's voice crackled through the line, "I wanted to update you on your mother's case. We've reviewed the security footage, and it's clear that the officers acted inappropriately. They ignored your mother's attempts to show her receipt and escalated the situation without cause." David's heart pounded in his chest. This was the confirmation he had been waiting for. "So what happens next?" he asked, his voice tense with anticipation. Angela sighed. "The mall's security team is conducting their own internal review, but we've recommended disciplinary action against both officers involved. The problem is, the mall's management seems reluctant to take any decisive action. They're worried about bad press, but they haven't made any concrete decisions yet." David clenched his jaw, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "That's not good enough, Angela. My mother was treated like a criminal for no reason. They can't just sweep this under the rug." "I know," Angela replied, her tone serious, "and we won't let them. We're pushing for formal consequences, but you know how these things go. It's going to take pressure from the public to force their hand." David nodded even though Angela couldn't see him. He knew she was right. The internal investigation might find the officers at fault, but without public accountability, the mall's management could easily drag their feet, hoping the story would fade from the headlines. But David had no intention of letting that happen. "Thanks for the update," David said before hanging up the phone. He knew what he had to do next. The next morning, David contacted a local civil rights lawyer, Jasmine Turner, who had made a name for herself by taking on cases of racial discrimination and abuse of power. He had met Jasmine a few years earlier while working on a case involving police reform, and he knew she was the right person to help escalate his mother's case. Jasmine agreed to take on the case pro bono, recognizing the importance of Evelyn's story. She filed a formal civil suit against the mall and its security company, citing racial profiling and wrongful detention. The lawsuit sparked renewed media interest, and within days the story was once again making headlines, this time with a legal angle. As the lawsuit gained traction, the pressure on the mall's management mounted. What had started as a local controversy had now become a regional issue, and the corporate headquarters of the mall chain were beginning to take notice. They couldn't afford to ignore the situation any longer. 1 week later, the mall's management finally announced that the two security officers, Jim Sanders and Mike Bennett, had been suspended pending further investigation. While it was a step in the right direction, David knew it wasn't enough. The damage had been done, and a simple suspension wouldn't be enough to make up for the trauma his mother had endured. The legal pressure, combined with the ongoing public protests, eventually forced the mall's corporate leadership to issue a public statement. They apologized to Evelyn and her family for the way she had been treated, acknowledging that the actions of the security team had been inappropriate and unjust. The statement went on to promise a full review of the mall's security protocols, along with mandatory training for all security personnel on how to handle situations with sensitivity and respect. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a victory nonetheless. The day the apology was issued, David and Evelyn sat together in the living room, watching the press conference on the television. The CEO of the mall's parent company stood at a podium, reading from a prepared statement. "We deeply regret the incident that occurred at our Brookside location, involving Mrs. Evelyn Mitchell. No customer should ever feel unsafe or disrespected while shopping in our stores. We are committed to making the necessary changes to ensure that this never happens again." David's jaw tightened as he watched the screen. It was the apology they had been waiting for, but it felt hollow. Words were easy, action was harder. He glanced over at his mother, who sat silently beside him, her eyes fixed on the television. "What do you think, Mom?" David asked quietly. Evelyn didn't respond at first. She stared at the screen, watching as the CEO continued to speak about the company's commitment to diversity and inclusion. Finally, she sighed and turned to David. "It's a start," she said softly, "but I don't know if it's enough." David nodded, understanding her hesitation. The apology was necessary, but it didn't erase the pain of what had happened. It didn't undo the fear and humiliation Evelyn had experienced that day at the mall. But it was something. It was a step in the right direction. In the weeks that followed the public apology, life in Brookside began to return to normal. The protests outside the mall gradually dwindled as the lawsuit made its way through the courts. Though Evelyn had never asked for any of this, she had become a symbol of resilience and justice for her community. One afternoon, as Evelyn and David sat together in the garden, tending to the flowers she loved so much, David broke the comfortable silence. "Do you think things will really change?" he asked, echoing the question she had posed to him weeks earlier. Evelyn paused, her hand gently brushing the petals of a blooming rose. She thought about everything that had happened, the pain, the fear, the fight for justice. She wasn't naive enough to believe that one incident would change the world overnight. But she also knew that change, real change, started with small steps. And in her own quiet way, she had taken one of those steps. "I think they already have," Evelyn said softly, her eyes meeting David's. "Maybe not in the way we hoped, but change has to start somewhere." David smiled, a sense of peace washing over him. He had spent his entire life fighting for justice in the world, but this time it had been personal, and though the road ahead was still long, he knew that they had made a difference. Evelyn looked out at her garden, the vibrant colors of the flowers swaying gently in the breeze. Life had a way of continuing, even after the storms. And while the scars of what had happened would never fully fade, she knew that she was stronger for having faced them. The road ahead was uncertain, but she wasn't walking it alone. The weeks following the apology brought a sense of resolution to the situation at Brookside Mall. Though the scars of what had happened remained fresh in Evelyn's mind, the corporate apology had made headlines and the media attention slowly began to shift elsewhere. But for Evelyn, the experience still weighed heavily on her. She never wanted to be a symbol of anything, yet she had become one. a representative of the fight for justice, dignity, and respect for all people, especially those who were vulnerable or often overlooked. Evelyn found herself receiving letters from strangers across the country, thanking her for speaking out and sharing their own stories of discrimination or injustice. Some of the letters were touching, others heartbreaking, but each one reminded her of the impact her story had made. In a quiet moment, sitting in her living room with the sunlight filtering through the lace curtains, Evelyn reflected on the journey she had unwillingly embarked upon. She thought about the countless people who had written to her, about the young woman who had approached her at the protest and thanked her for standing up. Evelyn's strength came from a deep well of life experience, but the responsibility of carrying a movement was something she was still learning to navigate. David noticed the change in his mother. Though the mall had made public promises to improve, though the lawsuit was still moving forward, Evelyn had grown quieter in the days that followed. It wasn't a silence of defeat. It was the quiet of someone who had faced a storm and now sought time to reflect on its aftermath. One evening after dinner, David sat down next to his mother at the kitchen table, a serious look on his face. "Mom, are you doing okay?" he asked, his voice soft but filled with concern. Evelyn looked up from her cup of tea, her expression thoughtful. "I'm fine, David," she said after a pause. "It's just a lot to take in. I never wanted to be in the middle of all this. I never wanted to be a symbol." David nodded, understanding the weight she carried. "I know, Mom. You didn't ask for any of this, but you've handled it with so much grace. You've helped so many people by speaking out. People are listening because of you." Evelyn sighed, looking down at her hands. "I hope so. I just want people to treat each other better. I don't want anyone to go through what I did." She paused for a moment, then added, "But it's hard to know if things will really change." David reached across the table, taking his mother's hand in his. "Change takes time, but you've started something, Mom. And even if it's slow, things are moving in the right direction." Evelyn smiled at her son, feeling the warmth of his words. She knew he was right, but the road ahead still felt long and uncertain. However, she also knew that she had done everything she could to stand up for herself and others. And in that, there was quiet strength. Several months later, the lawsuit against the mall and the security company finally came to a resolution. The legal proceedings had been long and arduous, with both sides presenting their cases. Jasmine Turner, the civil rights lawyer David had enlisted, fought tirelessly on Evelyn's behalf, ensuring that her story was heard and that the evidence of misconduct was clear. On the day of the final hearing, Evelyn and David sat in the courtroom, their hearts pounding with anticipation. The judge reviewed the evidence one last time before delivering the verdict. "The court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Mrs. Evelyn Mitchell," the judge declared. "The security officers acted without cause, and their treatment of Mrs. Mitchell constitutes wrongful detention and racial profiling. The mall and its security company are hereby ordered to pay damages to Mrs. Mitchell for the emotional distress caused by this incident." The courtroom was silent for a moment as the words sank in. Evelyn let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her hand gripping David's tightly. It was over. The legal battle had come to a close, and she had won. David smiled at his mother, his eyes filled with pride. "You did it, Mom. We did it." Evelyn nodded, though the victory felt bittersweet. The lawsuit had been about more than money. It had been about holding people accountable, about making sure that no one else would be treated the way she had been treated. And while the court's decision was a step in the right direction, Evelyn knew that the real change would come from how people treated one another in their daily lives. As they left the courtroom, Evelyn felt a sense of peace wash over her. The journey had been long and difficult, but justice had been served. And while the scars of the experience would remain, she knew that she had made a difference. In the weeks following the court's decision, life for Evelyn Mitchell slowly began to return to something resembling normalcy. The media attention had faded, and the lawsuit was behind her. The community of Brookside continued to rally around her, though the protests had subsided and people went back to their routines. For Evelyn, normalcy meant returning to the things she loved: her garden, her daily walks, and spending time with David. She no longer had to field calls from reporters or answer questions about the case. The quiet life she had cherished for so long had finally returned. One afternoon, as Evelyn tended to her roses in the garden, David came outside to join her. He had taken a rare day off from work, wanting to spend time with his mother and reflect on everything they had been through. As he knelt beside her, helping trim the rose bushes, David looked up at his mother. "Mom, you've inspired a lot of people, more than you realize." Evelyn smiled, brushing a stray leaf from her lap. "I didn't set out to inspire anyone, David. I just wanted to be treated with respect. That's all. And that's exactly why people are inspired by you," David replied, his voice filled with admiration. "You didn't do this for attention or recognition. You did it because it was the right thing to do. And that's what makes the biggest impact." Evelyn paused, considering his words. "I suppose you're right," she said softly, "but I'm just glad it's over. I'm ready to get back to my quiet life." David chuckled. "You've earned it." As the months passed, Evelyn found herself reflecting less on the events at the mall and more on the future. She had learned something important through the ordeal, that change, while slow, was possible. She had seen the impact her story had made on her community, and she knew that the changes the mall had promised were real. The new security policies were being implemented, and the officers involved in her case had been dismissed from their positions. But more than that, Evelyn had seen the power of speaking out. She had witnessed how one person's story could inspire others to demand justice, to stand up against wrongs, and to make their voices heard. It wasn't the role she had wanted, but it was one she had accepted with grace. One evening, as she sat on the porch with David, watching the sunset cast a warm glow over the horizon, Evelyn felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. "I've been thinking," Evelyn said, breaking the comfortable silence. David glanced at her, curious. "About what?" "About everything that's happened," Evelyn continued. "I never thought I'd end up in the middle of something like this. But now that it's behind us, I feel..." "Hopeful," David echoed. Evelyn nodded. "Yes, hopeful that things can change. Hopeful that people are starting to wake up to the injustice around them. And hopeful that, even in a small way, what happened to me helped move the needle." David smiled, his heart swelling with pride for his mother. "You did more than help, Mom. You made a real difference." Evelyn looked out at the garden, her eyes soft and contemplative. "Maybe I did," she said quietly. "But it wasn't just me. It was everyone who stood up, everyone who supported me. We did it together." David nodded, feeling the truth of her words. It hadn't been an easy journey, but they had come through it stronger, both as individuals and as a family. The bond between mother and son deepened through the struggle, and they emerged on the other side with a renewed sense of purpose. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Evelyn felt a deep sense of contentment. The storm had passed, and while the road ahead was still uncertain, she knew she was ready to face whatever came next, with her family, her community, and her quiet strength guiding her every step of the way. If you've been moved by Evelyn's story, remember that standing up for what's right isn't always easy, but it's necessary. We all have a part to play in making the world a better, fairer place. If you see injustice, speak out. If you witness someone being mistreated, stand by them. Together, we can create a world where everyone is treated with the respect and dignity they deserve. Thank you for watching and being part of this journey. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another story like this one. Join our community, and together we'll continue to share stories of hope, justice, and change.